This is 89.9 FM KGPR, Great Falls.
Hi, I'm Rodger McConnell. Join me for a special edition of Voices and Views. On the program, we present field evacuation hospital nurse from Vietnam, Diane Carlson-Evans, in a special encore presentation of On Point Veterans Talk Radio. I'm going to read some remarks made by my next guest at the opening ceremony for the parade commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Then, one day, Americans watched as the memorial was dedicated. Their eyes saw thousands of veterans marching or limping proudly in a parade down Constitution Avenue. Worn-out combat boots, boonie hats, field jackets, jungle fatigues, crutches and canes, wheelchairs, amputations, disfigured limbs and bodies, red crosses, unit patches. They saw that we had children and families who loved us. We had hearts, we had tears, we had memories and stories of bravery, heroism, passion, and purpose. We had strengths and vulnerabilities. We served with honor and pride. And some of us were even women.
I wrote that for my speech that I gave at the 25th anniversary of the dedication of the wall, which took place in 1982. It came from my memories of being there that day, and I thought I had put Vietnam behind me until I learned that there would be a memorial dedicated to Vietnam veterans, which came as quite a shock, given the fact that I felt like the nation had forgotten us after all those years. And like President Ford had said when he was in administration, let's put Vietnam behind us, which was actually an insult to all of us.
I understand what you're saying. Diane Carlson-Evans, welcome. Can you tell me a little more about the way you felt that day when you were giving that speech?
Well, when I heard President Ford make this remark about how do you put a war behind you?
That quickly, like it's sweeping it under the rug.
That let's not talk about it. It's gone, it's over, it's done with. Well, it wasn't over and done with. And for those of us who served there, it was still very much a part of our lives, and it was still very much a part of America. It was our history. It's something that we spent 10, 20 years in Vietnam, really, if you go back to World War II. But when I discovered that there would be a memorial honoring veterans, I decided to go. And I told my husband I needed to go alone, that I went to Vietnam alone. This was something I needed to do alone. But I did find some veterans in Wisconsin who wanted to drive out there. And so we actually got together in a van. I was the only woman veteran. And we drove out there together, and I was not prepared for what I was going to see.
Now, what year was this, Diane?
The wall was dedicated in 1982.
Okay, and this is 1982 then when you drove to D.C.
Right,
okay.
yeah, right. And of course, at the 25th anniversary where I made these remarks,
And that was
I was
07.
reflecting. Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay.
That was 2007, and I'm reflecting back as to what I saw then and how it was a turning point for me. It was a life-changing event to be there that day because I saw for the first time that my brother veterans and my sister veterans in a smaller way, because people really hadn't noticed or known that women were veterans. And I only ran into a handful of women veterans while I was there, but here's thousands of my brother veterans descending on Washington, D.C. And I hadn't seen them since Vietnam. And seeing them walking around on their crutches and in wheelchairs that they had survived, and some of them looking many of them looking like they had gone on with their lives and that we had done good.
Some clear eyes in addition to the ones with pain?
Yeah, and then to see the ones that were doing well, but then to see the ones who were so badly disfigured and so badly disabled and without arms and without legs, and it took me right back to Vietnam.
Speaking of going back, let's back way up to your roots and how that maybe prepared you for Vietnam or how it didn't prepare you. But you were born in Minnesota, were you not?
Mhm.
Okay, tell us
I think
a little more.
I think my roots did prepare me. My roots, my mother always said we came from good stock. Pioneering parents on both sides, immigrants from both sides. Mother's side immigrated to North Dakota, pioneers in the fields of North Dakota. On my dad's side, Scandinavians, ending up in Buffalo, Minnesota. The whole farm I think, culture where you work hard, you do well. My parents impressed upon all of us that we were going to be good citizens. But my two older brothers were of military age during Vietnam, and my oldest brother joined on his own. Devastating to my dad, who worried he would go to Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam because he fell out of an airplane, 101st Airborne, injured his knee. Second brother did get drafted, but they sent him to Korea. Now their third child out of 6 is me, and I'm studying nursing. I'm in college in Minneapolis. And with my brothers in the military and my neighbor boys going in great numbers, my brother had already 3 high school classmates who'd been killed in Vietnam. I felt that my brothers had to go or be in the military. Why shouldn't I? And I was studying nursing. So I made the decision, I should back up a little bit. When I was studying nursing, I was the only one, I think, in my class that would be glued to the 6 o'clock news. And I was watching Cronkite and others, and seeing the body bags and seeing the injuries and seeing the anti-war protests. This is 1967.
Okay.
66, actually.
That's what I was going to guess,
nurse.
66.
So 66, I joined as a student nurse. 67, I graduated, and the first thing I did then, once I was in the military, was volunteer for Vietnam, and I left in August of 68. At the height of anti-war protests, I think, I was at Fort Lee, Virginia, and for a few months before I left for Vietnam, and when I drove to Washington National Airport from Fort Lee to get my plane, the mall was smoking. There was fires everywhere. There were tents, hundreds, thousands, whatever, of tents and people.
War protesters, excuse me.
On the mall. And that was my goodbye to go to Vietnam.
What a way to get ushered out of the country. Huh?
So I knew that people had begun to really protest the war, and of course my thinking is, well, I'm not there to support the war, I'm going to support my brother soldiers. I'm going to support the soldiers. I wasn't savvy enough, I wasn't educated enough. I was 21, right out of college. I started college when I was 17, no kindergarten when you go to country school. And I didn't know the politics, I didn't know the terrain of Vietnam. All I knew was that there were patients there that needed to be cared for, and I would go.
Now, do you remember your first day in Vietnam?
Yes,
do you
I
remember
do.
your sensations that you
Well,
felt?
I remember how ridiculous it was that we arrived as women in Vietnam with high heels, nylons, short skirts, purses, and we're going into a war zone, and they send us like that, and no instruction. We'd had basic training, but we had no instruction in using a weapon, obviously. And so, first of all, where in the military wisdom did they think to send us over there like that? And of course, the flight, we were miserable because we were dressed up like that. And then the plane lands, and it's dark. And the troops with their bandoliers open the door to the plane and tell us to get out fast, keep our head down, and to get on the bus.
Was this in Tan Son Nhut now?
Yes.
Okay.
And,
That's in Saigon.
and then it's hot, it's August, and the smell is horrible, and the stench, the heat, all of that, and then we get into a bus, and it's like we're in a black hole because the windows on the bus are painted black and have chicken wire or something on the windows.
Well, at that time, kids were throwing grenades into buses, if you remember.
So I got on the bus, and then they took us to the 24th, I think, 90th Replacement Center, where the nurses...
Long Binh.
In Long Binh, where
Yes.
the nurses would stay for 2 to 3 days, and we'd get our orders, and we'd get our uniforms, finally, that were appropriate for the terrain and for the
No purses?
no purses, or high heels or nylons.
Well,
Who were we
you
supposed
probably
to
could have
impress
sold the
when we got
nylons
to
on the
Vietnam?
black market, though.
It was like, who were we supposed to impress when we arrived in Vietnam looking like that?
What do you think that smell was?
Well, it was diesel fuel, but I felt like the smell in Vietnam the whole time
That's
I was
what
there.
I
It
mean.
smelled like urine.
Well, it smelled awful.
It was a bad smell.
Yeah,
It was.
just not very accommodating at all. Okay, so you got attached to a unit, and that was where?
Well, my fourth day in country was another surprise, and that was, I got my assignment, and somebody next to me said, "Oh, you're so lucky, that's on the ocean." And I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to be on the ocean, and this is a
Sunbathing.
really good deal. And that was Vung Tau, which I later learned was an in-country R&R unit.
Mhm.
And yes, the area was beautiful. And it was a 400, I believe, bed evacuation hospital. But I got my orders, and I went to the helipad where I was supposed to be, and there was this chopper there, and it was a dust-off chopper.
That's
And-
not meaning medevac.
Medevac, a
Mhm.
Huey.
Yes.
And I was the only passenger. And I thought, well, this is a waste of money. This chopper has come all the way for me. It's going to spend all this fuel. I'm a really practical person. I think, why didn't they wait till they had a bunch of people to... So I'm this only passenger, and in the back with me is a door gunner. And I know now I'm in a war zone because that door gunner did not look at me. He looked at the ground the whole time. If he glanced at me, I didn't know it, because he had his eyes on the ground, his hands on the weapon, on the trigger, and he took his job really seriously. And I'm sitting there thinking, why doesn't this guy talk to me?
Right.
And
Welcome me to Vietnam.
but he was there to protect me, to get this nurse to the
Exactly.
36th evacuation
And protect
hospital.
himself, too.
And that
protect his
chopper.
pilot,
And
yes.
that's right, and he took his job seriously, and I remember I took a picture, and oh, how I wish I hadn't cut off his head. I took a picture, and I have the weapon, and he's looking down, and then we land at the helipad at the 36th evacuation hospital, and I remember seeing the Quonset huts, and they all have red crosses. And then I think, because I'm practical again, how dumb to paint red crosses on top of the hospitals. Wouldn't that be a target for the enemy? These things are just racing through my mind. But we land, and the door gunner finally looks at me, and he said, "Good luck, ma'am, and keep your head down." And I'll never forget his words.
Now, this was at Vung Tau.
Yes, and then I was assigned to a 60-bed post-operative soldiers that were either going into surgery or had come out of surgery, and every bed was full. And I realized this was going to be a busy time. And there was no time for training, just get to work. I'm sure there was some kind of orientation, but I had pretty good skills when I went to Vietnam. When I was 15, I started working with my mother in the Buffalo Memorial Hospital in Minnesota, where she was a nurse for 45 years. She was an RN. And I wanted to start working at the hospital with her when I was 15, and I went down to the emergency room with her. And we had lakes in Minnesota, a lot of lakes in
10,000,
Minnesota.
I think the license
So think of
plate
the number
says.
of drownings.
Oh.
Our town was on a railroad. We had a lot of railroad accidents and people getting across. We didn't have lights at the time, and people coming into the emergency room that had gotten crushed from a train going by, and it was on a major highway, and tons of car accidents. And I would watch my mother working.
So you were
on-
actually in the
I was in the emergency room
Oh,
with her,
wow.
and I would be watching her, and occasionally she would tell me to go get something, but she did the work and I watched, and if I could be a helper, and I watched her deliver babies and all of that. And then my internship when I was in nursing, I wanted to do my internship in the city hospital, which was all the Saturday nights, all the homicides, all the bad stuff came into the city hospital. And then I did another 3 months at the VA. I wanted to work with veterans, and I took care of World War I veterans in 1967 at the VA. So I had seen quite a bit, but nothing prepared me for Vietnam.
I don't think, maybe there's a perception with many people who are not familiar intimately with war that war is real sanitary. unless you've seen some traumatic wounds, you just maybe don't know what to expect. But you got initiated pretty quickly then after the...
Well, I did. And when you work in a stateside hospital, when somebody comes in and is dying of cancer, and that's not a pretty thing, and it's sad and tragic, but it's cancer. There's a reason why the person is dying of cancer. When somebody comes in a horrible car accidents happen every day. It was a car accident. Drownings happen every day. You do what you can to save them. These are things that happen to us as civilians. But you go into a war zone and you see 60 young men who've been wounded and injured and dismembered, and it's from a war. And why are we fighting this war? So that the questions that you ask and the futility and the morality and all these issues come up that do not come up in an emergency room in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You question the government. Why are we here? What is the mission? These soldiers have got to be fighting for a reason, or this is in vain. And then we'd patch these guys. What was really hard for me at first was we'd patch these guys up, and then we'd send them back. And then we'd see them the second time. They'd come back to the hospital.
Exactly.
When I worked in the burn unit, these children that would come in their village had been napalmed. And these kids would come in, and what napalm is and white phosphorus. It's like this jelly that sticks to the skin, and they would come in and it was still sticking to the skin, and it just keeps burning and burning and burning through. It's unrelenting. And I would look at these kids, and why? Why the children? What are we doing? Is this? And then there was the winning hearts and minds, and then I would say to myself, well, how are we winning hearts and minds? And then I would see the parents, if they survived the burning of the village, or grandparents or extended family, or the elders who would come in looking for the kids. And I would see how they loved their kids. They cried and they were hysterical. And, it's so... I think it was all sinking in, but I had a job to do, and I was doing it. But then I was transferred up to Pleiku. I requested a transfer.
How long were you in Vung Tau
north.
then altogether?
6 months.
6 months, okay.
And then I requested a transfer. I wanted to go further north.
Okay, now Pleiku, Central Highlands, as I think I remember the description of where it was. And it was fairly close to the Cambodian border, was it not?
It was. And as soon as I got up there, because I did have, a good report when I left Vung Tau, and when the chief nurse transferred me, she gave me my wish. I wanted to go where the fighting was. I wanted to go further north. Well, Pleiku was kind of the epicenter of fighting in January, February, March of Vietnam. It was bad all over.
That would have been 69.
69.
Right.
And they made me head nurse on a surgical unit, and it was a major slot, and I was a first lieutenant. I had just turned 22. I had just gotten, my bar, first lieutenant. And they made me the head nurse on this unit, and it was a major slot. And you ask how we got through our days, but we just, when I think about how, as nurses in Vietnam, I'll speak for myself, but the reason I'm so proud of the women I served with, and primarily nurses, because that's who I worked with. Well, there were a lot of other women in Vietnam in a variety of roles, but we were so young, and we had so little support from the senior officers. Like they put us in these units, and they just get to work. So we did, and we took it upon ourselves, or I took it upon myself, that everything that day that I brought to work depended on how brave I was, how smart I was, how quick I was, how observant I was, and how compassionate, and my skills. And your skills, you just got honed, because when you start...
You get a lot of practice.
When you've got that many patients and you're starting that many IVs, so pretty soon you are skilled, but you got to put your bravery next to that. And I think the bravery part came from the fact we were getting rocketed, we were getting mortared in Pleiku, and we had patients who died laying in their hospital beds when the shrapnel started flying around, and you're angry because this is a hospital.
Exactly.
Our patients are safe here, and for this to happen was such a betrayal. So that sense of betrayal, but also how you completely forgot about yourself. It was always about those patients, and they came first. They came first. And when the hospital was attacked, us women, our SOP was, we just were like robots. Grab your helmet, put the flak jacket on, and then get your patients under the beds. And, we had these long, long connectors on IVs and blood so that if they had to get under their beds, the tubes wouldn't get yanked out, or we'd have blood spurting out everywhere and IVs pulled out. And then we had the patients on respirators, and you could not move them because they were hooked up to,
life support
ventilators. And those guys usually had chest tubes and other tubes as well. So we threw mattresses on them. And then all these children, they threw in these kids who were injured in the crossfires of war into our units. So next to a GI who's on a ventilator is a crib with a Montagnard girl who's been burned terribly. And she's screaming her head off this one night, and I couldn't touch her. You can't touch kids with burns because that's not possible. You can't hold them. Their pain would be so great. And, after everybody else is, and I'm not just saying this because this was me, this is what nurses did in Vietnam. The patients came first. And we made sure all those patients were taken care of before we went under that bed. And we never ran to a bunker if we were on duty and our patients were, we never abandoned our patients. And, we put our lives at risk for them. And at the time, I never thought about it.
No, let's back up just for a second. This is 1969, January, February, March, I think you said. So you'd been in country when you got to Pleiku about 6 months. So you had 6 more months to go in your tour. I guess your tours were 12 months, like
Correct.
Most of the Army people. So you are then in a combat area, more so than Vung Tau. Combat areas were all over the country, but Vung Tau was
But
relatively
Pleiku was
safe.
much more hot. That's right.
Pleiku was more,
Right in there.
yes. So you're getting rocketed. Mortar rounds. Did they ever make any attempts to overrun that base camp that you were in?
Oh, we had sappers. We had a sapper that went through the concertina wire one night, and a couple of nights before, the sapper had killed one of our guards. We had as you know, for the Vietnam vets listening to this interview, I'm bringing back a lot of memories. For those who weren't there, it's information.
Exactly.
But the 71st Evacuation Hospital was surrounded by concertina wire, and for those who don't know, that's a huge, huge bales of wire that's the
kind
perimeter
of a coil.
to keep people out.
Like a slinky with barbs on it.
A slinky with barbs, thank you. And to keep people away. And then we had 4 guard towers in all corners, and in those guard towers, 24/7, were our guards. And these were actually, many of them, medics, and they had to take their turns up in the guard when they weren't working in the hospital.
Well, it sounds like a relatively small base camp then.
Well, no, 400 beds.
400 beds, but
hospital.
Okay.
And, small comparatively. I guess, I don't know how many acres it was, but the hospital itself was 400 beds, and it was a hospital that was surrounded by this concertina wire. And then right behind the hospital was the Air Force had put up, because there was an air base, a big air base in Pleiku, and they put up the radar for the air base right next to the hospital. And I understood years later that they did this all over Vietnam, and it was so. The hospitals, according to the Geneva Convention, are not supposed to be, mortared. But, well, of course, all rules go out in wartime.
Right.
So they were actually lobbying to take out the radar, but they would hit the hospital. But we all think they were actually trying to hit the hospital, too.
They may have.
But a sapper had gotten in and had killed one of our guards in the guard tower one night. And so then everybody were really on high alert, and one morning we woke up and there was a dead sapper hanging, dangling. We woke up and there he is dangling in the
Concertina wire?
In the concertina. It was not a safe place to be, and not for anybody. But it was our patients that, having to be out in the jungle, and in Pleiku there were tigers and.
Oh yeah, you mean real tigers out in the jungle? Oh,
yeah, real tigers, and we had some young men come in who had been severely mauled by tigers, and I used to think, what what are they telling the parents? We regret to inform you that your son, because there is, I remember one, there's a name on the wall. He was killed by the tiger. You know, we regret to inform you that your son was killed by a tiger.
In the jungles of Vietnam.
So did they tell the truth? I doubt it.
I doubt it too. I doubt it too. Now, in this evacuation hospital, I know there were days and then there were days when there were major battles going on. How many dust-off medevac helicopters might you see unloaded with patients at your hospital in a day?
Well, we would have gaggles. I used to call them gaggles. I don't know if that's
That's
not a military term or not, but of helicopters
Clumps.
that would come in. And you know, I know for us nurses, we've talked to the chopper pilots, the medevac pilots now, and patients. And you know, when a medevac came into a hot LZ or to rescue a patient, for that patient, seeing that chopper, that was like seeing God. And those chopper pilots are my heroes. For the dangers and the extreme situations that they would do anything, and many lost their lives because of it, to go in after those guys. And then the chopper pilots would bring them to us, and those chopper pilots have told us nurses that we're their heroes because then they left them with us, and then we took over. So it was that whole incredible team effort. But so our guys would say, well, when they heard that chopper, they were so relieved. When we heard choppers come in, we were not relieved. We were like, oh, how many choppers? We'd hear one, not so bad. Two, not so bad. Then we'd hear 3, 4. They would keep just coming in.
Usually 2 to 4 patients per helicopter, or how many would they
are you
cram on
kidding? They'd throw in as many as they could. And they were laying on top of each other sometimes. I mean, if they had to get a bunch out and they knew they couldn't get another chopper in, they were loaded to the...
Well, it wasn't what you'd call real orderly in the field when they're trying to get these guys some help. So that's understandable.
We'd call it a push. We had a push, or we'd say Mascal. And I remember, I'll just share one story because this will kind of give an example. But one night, told you I was head nurse in this unit, which meant that I always felt like I was on call. If they needed me, I was 24/7, but our shifts were 12 to 14 hours every day. And I was back in my hooch, and I feel like I never really slept in Vietnam. I was every sound every sound I heard, I was just on the verge of sleep, but the telephone rang, but I didn't need the telephone to tell me that I was already up and had my boots on, because I heard this sound of this chopper that was, what is that sound? It is just horrific. It's not a gaggle, it's not a bunch of choppers. I knew the difference, I can tell you. But this was the most bizarre sound, and then I could, oh my God, it can't be a Chinook.
Oh,
well,
boy,
it was.
Okay.
It was a Chinook load.
Chinooks are really large helicopters with a rotor at each end.
Well, that you can drive Jeeps into.
Exactly. You can hold a lot of patients.
And you could put the big containers in, and they brought in a Chinook load one night.
Of patients?
Of patients. It was a Chinook.
Like
full of patients.
30, 40? How many would you guess could fit in there?
Well, I know I opened up a unit, and I would not remember this and wouldn't even believe it myself, but I wrote to my parents that week and told them about that night.
In the information I gathered on you, there was a story about a young man who had a uniquely disfiguring event where his face was blown off, I think you said. And can you tell us about that night? That seems especially poignant to me. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can,
Okay.
because this young man has never left me, and he stayed with me all these years, I think, to comfort me. And because I had to let him go, what else could I do? But it was in Vung Tau, and this young man had come into the surgical intensive care unit, and I was working on the 60-bed unit, and it was quiet that night. Things were they were okay, and we had 4 nurses on duty that night and a bunch of medics, and so they called me, the chief nurse called me and said, I want you to go over to ICU tonight and just sit with this young man because he's not going to make it through the night. So I get over there, and there's a chair. They've put a chair by his bed, and I sit down. First I read his chart. I look to see what his chart says, and I do his vital signs. And he's a patient that is considered unexpectant, and that he's expected to die. And the nurses on the unit didn't want him to die alone, and they were busy in their unit, and they couldn't stay with him, and they couldn't comfort him, so they wanted somebody to be with him through the night. And I looked at his face, which wasn't there. It was, to tell you, he looked like a mummy. He was wrapped from head practically to foot. He was just wrapped everywhere. His whole body was wrapped. And I had to pull back the sheets to hold his hand. And his hand, he was wrapped to the wrist, and I pulled his hand out, and his hand was black. He was an African-American young man, and I would not have known that if I hadn't found his hand to hold it. And I told him my name, and I told him I was going to be with him, and I would not leave his side, and I asked him to squeeze my hand if he could hear what I said. And I expected, his hand was very cold and without feeling, and I didn't expect a response. And he gave me a very light, I know that he heard me by the squeeze that he gave my hand. I know he heard me. And so I said to him, I don't remember his name, but I said his name, and I said, "Oh, I'm so glad that you can hear me." And I said, "So I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you tonight, and I'm just going to keep talking, and I know you can't talk back." So then I had to come up with all these things. So I started with, I said, "I wish I knew where you grew up. I'll tell you about where I grew up." And I told him all about the dairy farm, and I told him about my siblings, and told him about my parents. And I don't remember what all I told him, but I told him I loved horses, and I said, "I wonder if you've ever ridden a horse." And I don't know, I just kept talking and talking to him, and I just couldn't let go of him. And I just kept thinking, if he could just hear me and know he was with me, and know that he wasn't alone. And then his hand went completely, I knew that life was draining from him, and then life did drain from him.
How long were you with him before you lost him?
You know, when I look back, it was like a hallucination. It was like so surreal, because here I am with this young man in Vietnam, and I was having a hard time letting go of him. And I don't know if it was, I can't tell you how many hours it was, but I do know it was several.
Okay.
And, but I've remembered him because later I remembered how angry I was that I was there with him and not his mother. How unfair that was. And that
maybe right then you were his mother, that even though you were 22 years old.
I was, but I wanted his mother to be there with him.
You are listening to Diane Carlson-Evans, Vietnam Field Evacuation Hospital nurse and the visionary behind the female Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is Voices and Views. I'm your host, Rodger McConnell.
Well, tell me about your homecoming. You came back to the United States. You got on an airplane in Saigon, probably. I'm assuming Saigon. You flew back to San Francisco.
Travis Air Force
Base. Tell me about your memory of that homecoming. What was that like?
Well, our chief nurse had warned us in Vietnam. This is now going to be July 30th or whatever day I flew. But it's the summer of '69. And you know what's been happening in the United States during that time. And she warned us and said, do not wear your uniforms when you go. Just when you get into California, put on civilians. Well, what was I going to put on? So I had on my uniform because I didn't have something else to wear. So I flew into Minneapolis, and I was shocked for what happened. My parents were late. My parents were always late. They were farmers, and if they had to get the hay in, and it was August, and if Dad had to get the hay in, he would be late. And I was so grateful they were late, because when our plane got in, there were some hecklers at the baggage area. And these GIs were on the plane with me, and they were also in uniform. And as my duffel bag is coming down the chute, one of the GIs, who was an enlisted man, said to me, "Ma'am, I'll get that for you." And I mean, that's the way they were. They were just so respectful and just so great. And so this sergeant is getting my bag for me, and this heckler comes over and says to him, "Let her carry her own damn bag. She's in a man's army." And I just like turned 10 shades of pale, because the sergeant took him by the neck and started beating his face and had him on the ground and was hitting him. And the other enlisted man who was with him, and I don't know if they knew each other, but he was trying to pull the sergeant off, so the sergeant wasn't going to kill this guy, because he was beating on him pretty hard. And I just said to these hecklers, I said, "It's not our fault. Don't blame us. We're over there fighting for you." And by then the security comes, and these guys are out of there. And I said, that's welcome home to these guys. Welcome home to me. And, I'll never forget those guys, because what were they doing? They were standing up for me, just like they did in Vietnam. We took care of each other in Vietnam. And what happened after that was Vietnam vets took care of each other after that. The country didn't take care of us. Our neighbors didn't. The community didn't, basically. I'm generalizing here. There were a lot of good people who did good things for us, too, like your story. But overall, we would take care of each other once we got home, just like we took care of each other in Vietnam. And that's why we have the memorials, the wall, the Vietnam Women's Memorial. We stood up for each other.
The dedication of the wall, 1982.
Yeah.
I read that one.
Yeah.
Well, that was the 25th anniversary, but the
right.
dedication of the wall.
1982, and I needed to go to that because I needed to find some names when I learned there were going to be names. And I wanted to find Sharon Lane's name. But the first name I went to find was the only patient's name that I could remember from Vietnam who I knew his name would be there, or I hoped it would be there, because I had taken care of him. And his name was Eddie Lee Evanson, and I remembered him because he was from Minnesota. And we talked about that he was from Thief River Falls, and his wounds were minor. And so he was on the unit for a long time, just recovering. Then he went back to the field. And when he went back, he got killed. And he had asked me to write to him, and I made the mistake of saying yes. And you learned in Vietnam, don't get close to your patients, because you just can't, it's not a good idea to get close. And I sent the letter, and I never heard back from him, but his commanding officer sent me a letter with my unopened letter and said, "I'm sorry, Eddie was not able to read this. He was killed in action." And so I needed to find his name, and I did. And when I found his name, I was not prepared for what would happen to me. I burst into tears, and I'd never cried over Vietnam, never.
Neither did I.
I never had cried over Vietnam. I had no emotions whatsoever, and I burst into tears, and I couldn't stop crying. And then I went to find Sharon's name. She was killed when I was there in June of '69. And I found Sharon's name.
From hostile action?
She was at Chu Lai, and she was working, and the hospital was attacked, and a piece of shrapnel hit her neck, and she was dead in seconds. She was in the hospital, and they could not save her. And it was then that I wasn't prepared for when I went home. And I looked at the plates, 68, 69, and I looked how high they were and how wide they were, and thought, my God, how many names are there that I may have touched? And so it was my grieving. And then I went through the stages of the grieving stages, which I had never done before. Very angry, very depressed, I started remembering all of them. One by one by one, they'd come back. And it was like I had to grieve for everyone. I couldn't collectively grieve. I had to grieve for every one of them. And then the man that I had cared for and held his hand that night. And I was angry at myself that I didn't know his name, didn't remember it. Of course, I would have had to have written it down. I couldn't find his name, and I couldn't touch his name because I couldn't remember it.
You didn't know it.
And
Yeah.
and I, it was just so many conflicted, deep, strong emotions that where do you go with them? So you go to the next place where you'd like to just not go there at all. And you think, well, it would be better just to be with them, to go be with them.
To kill yourself, you mean? Yeah. Suicide, that's always the way out. That,
And it
especially
was-
people who've been around that much violence.
And it wasn't scary.
Yeah.
That's the scary thing. It's not scary because when I came back from Vietnam, I was so numb to everything that I kind of felt like, well, it'd be easier now if I could just die. This would be a good ending to my life. I've done this. I
Have survived that.
And yeah, I was just so close. I'm still not afraid of death. I'm just not. I feel I'm 63 years old, and how lucky I am. I have all these years that those young guys didn't, and every day is a blessing. Every minute that you can breathe is a minute they didn't have.
Yeah.
And I celebrate every birthday. I'm so glad that I'm this old. I made it. And what a privilege that is.
Left a lot of people behind you. It's a tough
Who never had
realization.
children,
It's a
and-
lot of responsibility too. When you walked on and they didn't, and you think, well, I can't waste this. I can't waste this time that they didn't have.
I think that's what compelled me to do the Vietnam Women's Memorial, was like my work wasn't done. And there was
Let's frame this for everybody. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial goes in 82,
Mhm.
and you feel like it didn't really honor the people that you worked with, and
Mhm.
the people that you could most easily identify with, other nurses,
Yeah.
other ladies who were there. So the year was, when you first started this,
Mhm.
was what?
83.
1983, so not long after the dedication.
But it wasn't the wall that I thought the wall was perfect. It was perfect. It honored the men and women who died in Vietnam. The wall was so perfect. But when I read that there was all this controversy and all this controversy about the design and so on and so forth, the decision was made that there would be something more heroic and that would satisfy the faction who was unhappy, and therefore there would be a statue added. And when I saw the statue, and it was three men.
The three veterans,
The
yes.
three men, I thought, well, I wasn't bothered by the fact that they were going to add the statue. If this is what the men wanted, well, it's their memorial. Then it was like, but it's our memorial too. We were there too. And so I just thought, we have to complete the memorial now and honor the women.
The Vietnam Memorial dedicated 82, the
Statue.
three-man statue, the three-soldier statue.
84.
84. You're struggling with, was finance a problem too?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay.
It was a battle the whole way.
Well, how
It
much
was
did it ultimately cost?
Over $5 million
Oh.
in the end, for 9 years
Wow.
of 9 years of work.
Okay,
And-
now if we can just touch briefly on the people who helped fund this.
Mhm.
It wasn't any kind of
No, there-
appropriation from the government. It was
No.
all private donations.
It was all private donations, and it was amazing. We did get some large donations, but not in the millions. It was people, and largely the veterans, the combat
Okay.
veterans. When I first started this, and it was out on the street that this was happening, I started getting this check. It was an entire disability check.
Oh, boy.
And this wounded veteran, this wounded soldier, he was from Minnesota, he wrote to me and he said, "Dear Diane, I am going to send this check every month until that memorial is built. Please don't tell my wife."
Oh, he's sending his entire disability
And he
check?
did. He did.
Holy
He sent that
cow.
disability check for years. But it was so
Oh.
cute because he said, "Please don't tell my wife." But I'm thinking, It was his disability check. And this is what he wanted to do with it. But just think of and I mean, if that wasn't heartwarming, and if this is the kind of thing that kept my batteries charged. I was
What an
constantly
amazing
getting
story.
letters and phone calls from people who would pour their hearts out with their stories and just say things like, don't give up, this is so important. They really wanted this memorial. And I want to say, too, that never in my wildest dreams did I realize how much the men wanted this memorial as much as the women. And they were there for us, and they wrote some amazing letters to the editor. We'd get these crazy letters to the editor by these crazy people who would have all these crazy reasons why not to put the memorial there to honor women. And so the men would write in and say, I was wounded in Vietnam, and how dare you say these things, and if it wasn't for these nurses, I wouldn't be here to write this letter. And then they would just trash this person who wrote this stupid letter. Like, one letter it said that adding a statue of a woman to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would be like adding Elvis Presley to Mount Rushmore. It's not necessary.
Well, that is a pretty comedic statement. I don't know where the person was coming from. It's idiotic, but it is kind of comical.
But those are the kinds of letters that were written, and they were dead serious. What was interesting was we took so much trash from the public when we were in Vietnam as soldiers, and then when we came home, we took so much trash. Then 20 years later, we should still be taking trash from people about what we did to serve our country. And it just made me madder. But the madder I got, the harder I worked. And I thought, they're not going to treat us like this anymore without us. We're going to speak up. We're not going to be silent. We're going to stand up to them. We're going to tell them the truth. We're going to show them who we really are, and that we're good citizens. We did a good thing. We served our country. We're proud of our service. This is who we are, and don't ever trash us again. I thought the war protesters were great as long as they were protesting the war. Thank goodness they were protesting the war. But when it backlashed on
Well, there was a lot of
the
abuse.
veterans,
of the service people at the
they
time.
didn't separate the war from the warrior.
No, they didn't.
Yeah. But when I think of how the VA and how the government betrayed us, when veterans went to the VA with what we know now as PTSD, and what veterans from what war didn't have it, why weren't they prepared?
Right.
But to be treated the way they were, and the number of suicides, the number of veterans we have lost to suicide from the Vietnam War.
Well, and they continue.
Is a
The
national-
suicides are increasing now with the
Yeah.
Iraq vets and the Afghanistan vets. And locally, too, with Chris Dano. We lost Chris in 2007.
But the good thing is that now they are not, how should I say it? They are not being shamed. There's
Oh, no.
awareness
There's
that
an
this
honor.
happens in war, and even the generals are acknowledging that this is happening, this is real.
They've had
It's
to.
not mental illness, it's not weakness. This is a result of the impact of war on these young,
Well,
not just young people, there are people of all ages because of the reserves and the Guard. And that we need to address it, we need to treat it, we need to care for them, we need to face it up front, and we need to compensate them.
Well, and a lot of this is a result of the abuse that was heaped on us because we got mad as hell. We weren't taking it anymore. So a lot of people, Vietnam veterans who are in places of power or just the power, the voice of the people,
Yeah.
has pushed, or in my opinion, has pushed the powers that be in the direction that they had to go to take care of these wounded warriors, whether it's a psychological wound or whether it's a physical wound. Our country is now doing a better job. They certainly didn't with us, but that's okay.
But that's what we've done.
That was our sacrifice.
That's right, and if nothing came out of Vietnam, that Vietnam vets have stood up for veterans and said, never again shall a nation turn its back on our veterans. And because of us, our soldiers today are being treated differently. There's a long ways to go, we know that. But we honor our soldiers when they come home. We honor them while they're serving. We can disagree with the war, we can be anti-war, but we're not anti-soldier, and that is because of us.
Exactly.
And do you know, one of the things that was very hurtful, but there were so many hurtful things, and the chairman of the Commission of Fine Arts who was they were a commission in Washington, D.C., that we had to get our site and design approved. And of course, the first hearing, they rejected it and said there would never be another edition. And then later I fought them back and went to Congress and got a bill passed saying we would have this. So I had to go back to this Commission of Fine Arts and now show them the bill, and he knew we had it. So he had to work with us. He couldn't choose not to because I had a bill. And he was angry that I came back with power and clout, and I overruled him. The Congress overruled him. And so he wrote, he was interviewed by a newspaper in California. I think the woman journalist, her name was Betty Cunaberti. It can be looked up in the archives. And she interviewed him about me. And now where was this going to go? I had this bill saying we would have a memorial. And he accused me, he said, well, Ms. Evans is a member of the me generation, so we'll just have to see where this goes.
That built a little fire under you a little.
The me generation, my brother and sister veterans are the veterans who suffered and died for this nation. That was my generation. Those are the people I knew. And we were not the me generation.
Well, you were pretty me-less in Vietnam.
We were selfless.
That's
and for him
exactly
to that dig, that was, and then he said the doors of Ghiberti would not satisfy Ms. Evans. Well, it was a very arrogant statement about the doors of Ghiberti are supposed to be these priceless, that nothing would satisfy me, that I was going to get what I wanted. And yes, I did.
Good deal.
And he had to deal with me again and again and again, and we now have a beautiful memorial.
You probably don't have the best relationship with that particular person, but...
Well, actually, at the end, he actually, in the very end, he actually liked the memorial. He actually had
maybe
good things to...
Maybe opened his eyes, too.
Opened his eyes. That
yeah.
was all about opening people's eyes. Well, Vietnam veterans, we had to open people's eyes as to who we were. They had us demonized. They had Vietnam veterans as drug-crazed, glassy-eyed baby killers. They had stereotypes of these guys, and
there were events over there. My Lai.
There were times. It was not
massacre.
The perfect war, and what war is. But there's atrocities in every war. But they had to bring out the atrocities of the Vietnam vets to make them look like the worst in ever. And it was terrible. But World War II, when you read about the atrocity, war brings out the worst, and it brings out the best. But
it does bring
whenever
out
they
both.
could demonize Vietnam veterans, they did.
Well, and the funny thing of that is the media during the Vietnam era was a little lax in that the things that happened as a result of friendly fire or whatever you want to call it, and a lot of the events that occurred where there were civilian casualties because of things that we did that were our fault. The difference is, and maybe people listening today don't realize, that the enemy that we faced in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, can't remember their other title, but they committed these atrocities routinely. That was as part of their way of dealing with winning the hearts and minds of the countrymen. They just brutalized them to scare them to death so that they wouldn't help us. What was the story about a group of American medical people going into a village and vaccinating all the children against cholera or whatever it was over there? And the Viet Cong then went into the village, the very same village, and chopped all the arms off of these kids. Mm-hmm. So at least I think that's a reality.
It is,
sometimes you get myth confused. But
well, it's so multifaceted. And, I remember this napalming of these children and seeing these little kids come in. And I didn't swear at the pilot for doing it. I didn't condemn the pilot.
Anything else that you'd like to say to anybody out there?
I would like to say what a privilege it was to serve my country. Despite being in a war that I later knew to be wrong and opposed, I would do it again. It was worth it was worth everything to be able to have the opportunity to care for these wounded soldiers and to see their bravery and to see the goodness in them and to be able to continue to fight for them. Once a nurse, always a nurse, I guess, and that I didn't realize how much unfinished business I had after Vietnam and the stories that needed to unravel and unearth. And it was only through our stories that people were going to see what we did and who we really are. And that was so important to me. And so, and it takes a lot of courage to share those stories, but I urge everyone to do it and to continue fighting for each other and to continue supporting our current generation of soldiers and veterans. What better thing can we do?
What better thing can we do?
What better thing can we do? Are we serving them as well as they are serving us? Now that's not an original
question.
quote. That I
like
heard
it,
Barack
though.
Obama say that when he was campaigning, and I never forgot what he said because it was one of his things. He said, was referring to the veterans in this country, all veterans, and he said, "Are we serving them as well as they are serving us? Veterans deserve first-rate care, not second-rate, first-rate." So thank you, Rodger. Thank you for this interview. I'm so honored to have been invited.
Thank you for all you've done and all you continue to do.
Thank you, Rodger.
You've been listening to Diane Carlson-Evans, former Vietnam Field Evacuation Hospital nurse and now Veterans Advocate, on Montana Public Radio, KGPR, Great Falls. This is Voices and Views. I'm your host, Rodger McConnell.